At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had a problem no one wanted to admit out loud. The country was growing too fast. Industrialization was exploding. Cities were swelling. Money was circulating in unprecedented volumes. But the law did not keep up. Criminals crossed state lines with ease. Banks were robbed. Politicians were bought. Unions were infiltrated by organized crime. And there was no federal force truly capable of acting. Each state handled its own chaos. And chaos was winning. It was in this vacuum that something was born that would forever change the balance of power in the United States. Not as an ordinary police force, not as a transparent institution, but as a silent machine of information, surveillance, and control. An agency created to protect the country. That would learn very early that whoever controls information controls everything. Before the FBI, there were no clear limits. In 1908, there was officially no federal police in the United States. The Department of Justice relied on temporary investigators, agents borrowed from the Secret Service, or private detectives. It was an improvised, fragile system, and easily corrupted. Federal crimes were rising, interstate cases multiplied, and Washington was losing authority. The then Attorney General Charles Bonaparte, yes, a direct descendant of Napoleon, made a controversial decision. He quietly created a permanent force of federal investigators, without clear approval from Congress, without public debate, without well-defined limits. There, the embryo of the FBI was born. But what few realized is that the real power of that agency would not be weapons or badges, it would be information. J. Edgar Hoover, the man who understood the game before everyone else. A few years later, a young bureaucrat entered the agency. Name, J. Edgar Hoover. He didn't look dangerous, he wasn't charismatic, he wasn't a field man. But Hoover had something rare. An absolute obsession with files, records, dossiers, and control. While others thought about arresting criminals, Hoover thought about something much bigger. Who do I need to watch today, so I am never threatened tomorrow? When he took over the agency's leadership in 1924, Hoover began transforming it into something completely different. Nothing escaped. Politicians, judges, journalists, activists, artists, presidents. Everyone at some point would enter the files. Officially for national security, unofficially to ensure that no one would ever have enough power to remove him. The agency that answered to no one, Hoover remained in command of the FBI for 48 years. 48. He served under 8 different presidents, from Calvin Coolidge to Richard Nixon. None of them dared to fire him. Why? Because Hoover had dossiers on all of them. Extramarital affairs, hidden illnesses, financial scandals, recorded private conversations. The FBI was not just an investigative agency. It was an internal surveillance network, operating in the shadows of power. And the deeper the country fell into crises, wars, fear of communism, racial conflicts, the more power Hoover accumulated. Always using the same argument. If the public knew what we know, they would demand even more surveillance. Public heroes, invisible methods. To the average citizen, the FBI looked heroic. In the 1930s, federal agents became stars. They hunted famous criminals like John Dillinger Bonney and Clyde Pretty Boy Floyd Hollywood, helped build the myth of the G-Man, incorruptible, intelligent, patriotic. But while the public watched movies, the FBI quietly expanded its methods. Illegal wiretaps, infiltrations, manipulation of informants, violations of privacy without warrants, all justified by the most powerful word of the 20th century: security. The first sign that something was wrong. The problem wasn't only what the FBI did to criminals, it was who it began to treat as criminals. Union leaders, intellectuals, civil rights leaders, social movements, any group that questioned the existing order entered the radar. And the FBI's radar did not forget. In the silence of the archives, operations were born that would only be revealed decades later, when it was already too late to repair the damage. Secret programs, smear campaigns, psychological destruction of internal targets, all carried out by an agency officially created to protect democracy. The question no one wanted to ask. By the late 1940s, the FBI had become the most powerful law enforcement institution in the world. But a question began to surface, whispered, never spoken publicly. Who watches those who watch everyone? Because when an agency accumulates information secrecy, political power, and fear as fuel, it stops being just a security institution. It becomes a state within the state, and the darkest side of this story was only just beginning. Fear does not need facts to grow. It only needs repetition. After World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower, but also as a deeply anxious nation. The enemy was no longer visible armies or distant battlefields. The new threat was invisible, ideological, and supposedly everywhere. Communism. It was portrayed not as a political belief, but as a contagion. Something that infected minds. Something that hid behind smiles, books, unions, classrooms, and protest signs. And fear, once institutionalized, becomes policy. For the FBI, this was not a crisis. It was an opportunity. From investigation to ideology. Officially, the mission was clear: protect the nation from subversion. Unofficially, the definition of subversion expanded until it lost all boundaries. Being a communist was suspicious. Associating with one was dangerous. Defending civil liberties was questionable. Questioning authority was a red flag. The line between criminal behavior and ideological dissent disappeared, and the FBI stood at the center of that transformation. Hoover understood something crucial before most politicians did. Fear creates consent. If the public was scared enough, it would tolerate almost anything. The rise of loyalty tests and blacklists. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the FBI had embedded itself deeply into American life. Background checks became tools of exclusion. Loyalty programs determined who could work, teach, publish, or perform. Actors lost careers. Writers were silenced. Scientists were sidelined. Teachers were dismissed. Not because they committed crimes, but because they were suspected of the wrong ideas. Many never knew the evidence against them. Many were never formally accused. Many had no way to defend themselves. Their punishment was social death. And the FBI's files made sure it was permanent. Guilt by association, the perfect weapon. One of the most effective tools of this era was deceptively simple. Association. You didn't need to say anything radical. You didn't need to break the law. You only needed to know someone who did, or attend a meeting, or sign a petition, or appear on a mailing list. Once your name entered the system, it rarely left. Files grew thicker with time, not thinner. Suspicion accumulated. Context disappeared, and the absence of evidence was never evidence of absence. McCarthy was loud. The FBI was silent. History often remembers Senator Joseph McCarthy as the face of the Red Scare. He was visible, aggressive, televised. But McCarthy burned out quickly. The FBI did not. While McCarthy shouted accusations in public hearings, the FBI worked quietly, methodically, permanently. No speeches, no explanations, no accountability, just files and consequences. When McCarthy fell, the system he fed remained intact. The psychological cost no one measured. The damage of this era was not only political, it was psychological. People learned to self-censor, to avoid conversations, to distrust neighbors, to stay silent. Fear reshaped behavior. The FBI didn't need to arrest millions. It only needed to make examples. Once fear is internalized, surveillance becomes almost unnecessary. People begin policing themselves. A dangerous precedent is set by the mid-1950s. Something irreversible had happened. The idea that a federal agency could monitor citizens without warrants, compile secret ideological profiles, influence employment and reputation, operate without transparency, was no longer shocking. It was normalized, all under the banner of national security, and once power is normalized, it rarely shrinks. The shift from enemies abroad to enemies within. At first, The targets were external threats, then foreign sympathizers, then domestic organizations, then individuals. The scope kept widening, and the logic remained the same. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. History would later prove how dangerous that sentence truly was. The quiet expansion. By the end of the Red Scare's peak, the FBI had achieved something unprecedented. It had embedded fear into culture. It had blurred law enforcement with ideology. It had taught the nation to accept surveillance as protection. And it had done so largely without resistance, because most people believed it was happening to others. They were wrong. By the late 1950s, the FBI had mastered something far more powerful than arrests: control. Not control through visible force, but through disruption, intimidation, humiliation, and psychological pressure. The goal was no longer simply to investigate crime. It was to neutralize influence. And to do that, the FBI launched one of the most secretive and controversial programs in American history. It was called COINTELPRO, a program that officially did not exist. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was not announced. It was not debated in Congress. It was not approved by courts. For years, it officially did not exist. On paper, it was designed to monitor extremist organizations. In reality, it became a tool to sabotage political movements from within. The targets were not criminals. They were voices. Who became the enemy? The list of targets was broad and revealing. Civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, student movements, black liberation leaders, socialists, pacifists, journalists, anyone capable of mobilizing people outside government-approved channels. The FBI did not ask, "Are they breaking the law?" It asked, "Are they dangerous to the existing order?" And that question justified almost anything. The methods: subtle, cruel, effective. COINTELPRO did not rely on mass arrests. That would draw attention. Instead, it used psychological warfare. Anonymous letters sent to spouses accusing leaders of infidelity. Forged documents designed to spark internal conflict. False rumors planted to destroy trust. Pressure on employers to get people fired. Constant surveillance meant to exhaust and intimidate. The goal was fragmentation. To make movements implode from the inside. To turn allies into enemies. To create paranoia so intense that organizing became impossible. Martin Luther King Jr. A turning point. One of the most shocking targets of COINTELPRO was Martin Luther King Jr. Publicly, he was celebrated as a moral leader. Privately, the FBI labeled him a threat. Not because he promoted violence, but because he had influence. The Bureau wiretapped his phone calls, recorded his private moments, collected deeply personal material. Then came the letter. An anonymous message sent to King, implying that his private life would be exposed, and strongly suggesting suicide as the only way out. It was psychological cruelty at its most calculated, and it was authorized at the highest levels. Why exposure was the ultimate weapon? The FBI understood something fundamental about power. Reputation is fragile. You don't need to disprove a leader. You only need to make people doubt them. Once doubt spreads, movements fracture. Supporters hesitate. Allies distance themselves. Momentum dies. COINTELPRO did not aim to win arguments. It aimed to destroy credibility. The chilling internal FBI memos revealed how normalized this had become. Targets were described as neutralized. Organizations were to be disrupted. Leaders were to be discredited. This was not law enforcement language. It was counterinsurgency language, applied domestically, against American citizens. The silence that protected everything for years. None of this was publicly known. The press didn't report it. Courts didn't question it. Congress didn't investigate it. The FBI operated behind layers of secrecy, and Hoover ensured that oversight remained minimal. Because secrecy was not just protection, it was power. The break-in that changed history in 1971, a small group of activists did something unthinkable. They broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. Not to steal money. Not to sabotage equipment, but to steal documents. What they found and leaked shocked the nation. COINTELPRO was real. The files revealed systematic abuse, deception, and manipulation carried out by the federal government against its own people. For the first time, the myth cracked. Official outrage, quiet consequences. Public reaction was explosive. Investigations followed. Congress held hearings. The FBI promised reforms. COINTELPRO was officially shut down. But very few people were punished. No major trials, no prison sentences, no true reckoning. The program ended on paper. The mindset did not. A lesson learned, just not the one people expected. The FBI learned something important from COINTELPRO. Not that it went too far. But that exposure was the real danger. Future programs would be more compartmentalized, more legally insulated, more deniable, less visible. Power adapts faster than outrage fades. The cost of winning silently. By the early 1970s, many movements were weakened. Leaders were exhausted, organizations were divided, trust was shattered. The FBI had succeeded without mass violence, without open tyranny, by mastering fear, doubt, and isolation. And it proved something chilling. You don't need authoritarianism to suppress dissent. You only need secrecy, justification, and time. When J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972, many believed an era had ended. For nearly half a century, he had embodied the FBI. His death felt like a release, a chance for correction, a moment to restore balance. The timing seemed perfect. COINTELPRO had been exposed. Public trust was shaken. Congress was embarrassed. The press was alert. Everything suggested reform was inevitable. And reform did come. Just not in the way people imagined. The illusion of accountability. In the years following Hoover's death, investigations multiplied. Congressional hearings, oversight committees, new legal frameworks. The message was clear and reassuring. This will never happen again. Limits were announced. Guidelines were written. Surveillance supposedly required stricter authorization. On paper, the FBI had been restrained. In practice, something more subtle occurred. The Bureau didn't lose power. It learned how to operate within the appearance of restraint. From brute force to legal architecture under Hoover, power was personal. Files were hoarded. Decisions were centralized. Authority flowed from fear. After Hoover, power became institutional. Legal language replaced blunt tactics. Processes replaced personalities. Bureaucracy replaced intimidation. But the reach remained. Surveillance didn't disappear. It was reclassified. Infiltration didn't stop. It became intelligence gathering. Psychological pressure didn't end. It was reframed as risk mitigation. The same tools, now wearing cleaner uniforms. Technology becomes the new multiplier. The real transformation wasn't ideological. It was technological. Computers replaced filing cabinets. Databases replaced paper trails. Digital records replaced human memory. Information that once took years to compile could now be accessed in seconds. And unlike Hoover's era, this information didn't decay. It persisted. Mistakes followed people indefinitely. Suspicions never fully erased. Context permanently flattened. Power no longer depended on a single man. It lived in systems. New threats, familiar logic. Every expansion of power needs a justification. For the FBI, the late 20th century provided several. Drug trafficking, organized crime, domestic terrorism. Each threat came with new authorities. Each authority came with fewer questions. And each time the argument was familiar. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary measures. What was extraordinary slowly became routine. The normalization of secrecy. One of the most important shifts after Hoover was cultural. Secrecy stopped being controversial. It became expected. Classified operations were no longer shocking. They were assumed. Redacted documents became standard. The phrase "we can't comment" ended conversations. The public learned to accept that there were things it simply wasn't allowed to know, and acceptance is the most durable form of control. Oversight in name, distance in reality. Oversight committees existed, but oversight was selective. Members were briefed partially. Information was compartmentalized. Critical details were often withheld under national security claims. You cannot meaningfully oversee what you cannot fully see, and the FBI understood that better than anyone. The quiet rebuilding of trust public perception mattered, so the Bureau invested in image, television consultants, crime shows, public-facing success stories. The FBI became synonymous with professionalism, intelligence, and restraint. The dark chapters faded from collective memory. And without memory, accountability weakens. Power without a face. Perhaps the most important change after Hoover was this. There was no longer a single villain. No central figure to blame. No personality to fear. Power became faceless, distributed, procedural, self-justifying, and faceless power is harder to challenge than tyrants. A dangerous equilibrium. By the end of the Cold War, the FBI had reached a new equilibrium. It was no longer openly abusive, but it was more entrenched than ever. Legally fortified, technologically empowered, culturally normalized. And then came a moment that would change everything. A moment that would dissolve many of the limits imposed after Hoover. A moment that would redefine security. Forever. On the morning of September 11, 2001, everything changed. Not gradually, not philosophically. Instantly. Fear returned to American life with a force few generations had ever experienced. The enemy was no longer abstract ideology or distant geopolitics. It was visceral, televised, personal, and fear once again became permission. For the FBI, 9/11 did not represent a failure to be corrected slowly. It represented an emergency, and emergencies suspend restraint. From restraint to urgency. Before 9/11, intelligence agencies were criticized for overreach. After 9/11, they were criticized for not doing enough. The question shifted overnight. No longer, are we violating civil liberties? But, why didn't we stop this? That single shift unlocked power faster than any legislation ever could. The Patriot Act. Speed over deliberation. Within weeks, sweeping laws were passed. Most lawmakers barely read them. The public barely understood them. Fear rushed everything forward. The Patriot Act dramatically expanded the FBI's authority. Broader surveillance powers, easier access to personal records, lower thresholds for monitoring, delayed notifications, secret warrants. What once required high standards now required urgency. And urgency does not argue. It demands. The return of mass surveillance. The post-9/11 FBI didn't invent surveillance, but it scaled it. Phone metadata, internet activity, financial transactions, travel records, social connections. Patterns mattered more than individuals. You didn't need to be guilty. You only needed to resemble someone who might be. Algorithms replaced suspicion. Probability replaced evidence. And oversight struggled to keep pace. From investigation to prevention, a subtle but profound shift occurred. The FBI moved from solving crimes to preventing possibilities. Prevention sounds noble, but it has no natural limits. You can always prevent more. You can always justify one more layer of monitoring. Because how do you measure the crimes that never happened? Communities under the microscope. Entire communities felt the shift. Mosques were infiltrated. Informants were embedded. Conversations were monitored. Trust was eroded. Many were never accused of anything, but suspicion became ambient. And ambient suspicion reshapes behavior. People spoke less, organized less, trusted less. Fear didn't need to knock on the door. It lived inside the walls. Secrecy returns to dominance. Oversight existed, but secrecy expanded faster. Programs were classified, justifications were redacted, court rulings were sealed. Even legal interpretations of the law were hidden from the public. The rules existed, but you weren't allowed to know them. Technology outpaces morality. Data collection accelerated. Storage became cheap. Analysis became automated. Retention became indefinite. Mistakes were preserved forever. False positives lingered. Context disappeared. And the system assumed its own correctness. Because when systems grow large enough, they stop asking if they should exist and start assuming they must. The familiar promise returns. Every expansion came with reassurance. This is temporary. This is targeted. This is necessary. But history had seen this pattern before. Temporary powers rarely expire. Targeted tools tend to widen. Necessary measures redefine necessity. Fear never willingly gives power back. The cost no one calculates. The true cost of this era wasn't just legal. It was cultural. Privacy became negotiable. Suspicion became normal. Silence became safety. And slowly, without a single dramatic announcement, the boundaries shifted again. The paradox of protection. By the late 2000s, the FBI was larger, faster, and more technologically capable than ever. But the original question returned, sharper this time. Does a system designed to prevent every threat eventually treat everyone as a potential one? History suggested the answer was uncomfortable. By the time the United States entered the 2010s, the FBI no longer needed to justify its existence. It was embedded in systems, in laws, in expectations. The question was no longer whether the Bureau should have power, but how much power was simply assumed to be necessary. And assumptions are rarely debated. From external threats to internal fractures, the enemy was no longer only foreign, it was domestic. Polarization intensified, social movements returned, distrust of institutions grew, information fragmented, and once again the FBI stood at the center of interpretation. What is extremism? What is dissent? What is dangerous speech? What is merely unpopular opinion? These questions were no longer abstract. They were operational. Data replaces intent. In the modern era, intent is secondary, data is primary. You are not judged solely by what you do, but by patterns that resemble what others have done. Search histories, social networks, online behavior, associations, language choices. The FBI does not need to accuse, it needs to flag. And flags do not require guilt. They require correlation, the quiet permanence of suspicion. In previous eras, surveillance was episodic. Now it is ambient. You are not being watched. You exist within systems that watch by default. This changes nothing immediately, which is precisely why it is effective. There is no knock on the door, no letter, no warning, just silent categorization. And categorization is difficult to escape, because you rarely know it exists. Oversight in a world too complex to oversee oversight still exists, but it is overwhelmed. Algorithms are proprietary. Data pipelines are classified. Decisions are distributed across agencies, contractors, and automated systems. Responsibility becomes diffuse. When something goes wrong, there is no single actor to confront. Only processes, and processes do not feel guilt. Politics, pressure, and perception. The FBI insists on neutrality, and institutionally, it strives for it. But perception matters more than intent. In a polarized nation, every investigation is interpreted through ideology. Every action becomes evidence, for or against. And when trust collapses, even restraint looks suspicious. This is the paradox of modern power. The more authority an institution holds, the less legitimacy it is granted by half the population. What never changed? Across more than a century, one thing remains consistent: the logic. Fear justifies expansion. Expansion normalizes power. Power resists contraction. Different enemies, different technologies, same structure. The FBI did not become powerful overnight. It grew incrementally. Each step rational, legal, and defensible in isolation. That is how enduring systems are built. The final question: The FBI is neither purely villain nor simple guardian. It is something more complicated and more unsettling. An institution shaped by fear, rewarded for anticipation, and insulated by secrecy. Its darkest moments were not accidents. They were outcomes of incentives. And incentives, once embedded, outlive generations. So the question that began this story returns, unchanged, unanswered. Who watches those who watch everyone? Because history shows that power rarely announces when it crosses a line. It simply keeps moving it.